Welcome everybody to this morning's webinar on affirmative fair housing marketing plan. And you can see at the top left, we're joined by Liz Keegan from the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan. Yay.
Good
I'm
morning and
Steve
thank you.
Tomkowiak from the Fair Housing Center of Metropolitan Detroit. Always a pleasure to be with Liz. She's enormously experienced, knowledgeable, personable, checks every box. And
I would
she's
say
going to
the
have a lot
same.
to say. Well, thanks. Um, no, really, it's a pleasure.
Yeah.
So I'll let you advance it. These are the ground rules. I was always told the ground rules. Where do the ground rules go? They go on the ground, obviously. So the webinar is being recorded. Please make sure to put the questions into the Q&A, not the chat. If you put them into the chat, no one's going to be harmed by it. We'll still pick it up and answer it. It's just easier to work with the Q&A. This webinar provides general information, is not intended to give specific information or advice as to a particular situation. That's our contact information at the bottom right. Of course, you can also contact Liz at her office as well. We've got a slide at the end which lists the contact information for all of the fair housing centers. But we are available to help pretty much free of charge. So please take advantage of that opportunity. And this video will be posted at fairhousingdetroit.org. Liz, I think that you probably will be posting it as well on your site.
Yes. Yes, we will. Happy to do so. Thank you.
And the slides will also be made available as well. And we go on to the next one. So thank you to MSHDA for sponsoring this training. There's been several webinars and other kind of outreach programs sponsored through MSHDA. Very generous grant. We appreciate them very much so. And to say they're a strong supporter of fair housing is an understatement. They're tremendously involved. They're passionate advocates and committed to fair housing and all of their programs. So
Absolutely.
on the next slide, I'm sorry.
Liz, we have a number of trainings coming up, and I think you do too. So I was just going to say, please continue to check both of our websites because MSHDA is really enabling, I'd say probably a record level of education and training series to be made available with their grant dollars.
Yeah, absolutely. So why is there a need for affirmative fair housing marketing plan? This is data that we obtained from HUD's AFFH, formerly Furthering Fair Housing Data and Mapping Tool. And the developments, I'll show the names later, but initially I wanted to take them off just because, I don't know. But anyways, we're doing analysis of impediments for municipality. And these are the various developments. And I just use the initials for them. It shows the number of units. And it has the racial breakdown: white, Black, Hispanic, Asian, and whether or not there's children. I sorted it by white. The top one, SGT, has 92.68% white. At the bottom, OS has 4.69% white and 94.79 Black percentage. And if you go back to the top, SGG has only 3.41%. And these are all housing located within the same municipality. You see the difference. And then when it comes to an Asian population, CC, it's cooperative property, has 34.4% Asian and almost like none in the other properties. So it really, really stands out.
It does. Absolutely.
Yeah, go to the next slide. I have kind of green is okay, yellow, caution, red, needs work, right? And it's just kind of shocking to look at this. And so obviously, is there a need for a affirmatively fair housing marketing plan? Absolutely. And this shows it. I'm not picking on this area or picking on this jurisdiction or picking on these developments. These are situations that virtually everybody faces. It just, it is what it is. So, we'll look at ways and we can explore it, but you can't do a training without showing that there's a need for it. And I think this shows that there is a need, right?
Absolutely.
We'll get into some of the, why we care about this or what the policy is, and then get into Liz is going to get us into a lot of the specifics. Thanks. So here's our agenda. We're going to do an overview of the HUD's Affirmatively Fair Housing Marketing Plan requirements. Then we're going to look at the regulatory contract requirements for AFMP or AF. They say it two ways: AFHM plan or AFHMP, and we kind of use them synonymously as well. We'll look at MSHDA's requirements for their plans, and then we're going to look at the key components for a HUD plan and the key components for a MSHDA plan. And then Liz is going to take us through a lot of the common mistakes in the AFMP planning and best practices. She's going to hit a lot on advertising, marketing, social media, because that's important. And then we're going to look at some key resources, and then we'll take time for any questions that you have. So, overview of it. First, what's the legal basis for this? Is a provision of the Fair Housing Act, Section 805E5. It's codified at 42 United States Code, Section 3608E5, requires HUD in all of its programs and activities to basically develop, or how would I put it? To, I got my face here covering up my notes here, to administer, that's the word, administer the programs and activities relating to fair housing, and do it in a way that affirmatively furthers fair housing. That sat unused for probably from 1968 to around the 1990s. Finally, they kind of blew the dust off that provision and started to take it seriously. So here's, so then HUD said, they did for affirmatively furthering fair housing, and they also did with the affirmative fair housing marketing plan. And the reason I bring up some of the affirmatively furthering fair housing requirements, because that's the same concept and notion that underlies the importance of the affirmatively furthering affirmative fair housing marketing plan requirement. So what's the legal authority? Sections 804 A through F of the Fair Housing Act prohibit discrimination against 7 protected class categories and sex. So it says sex. It is interpreted and applied to include both sexual orientation and gender identity, because that's viewed as being sex-based. Covers disability and familial status. The Fair Housing Act actually uses the word handicap. That's synonymous with disability. There's no meaningful difference between them. There's also, on top of this, I'm going to start kind of at the bottom. There's Presidential Executive Order 11063 that prohibits discrimination because of race, color, religion, creed, sex, or national origin. That was administrative order by President Kennedy in 1962. Several presidents have then amended or expanded upon that as well. And then Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act provides that no otherwise qualified person shall, by reason of their disability, be excluded from or denied full rights and the benefits to participate in any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. I bring that up because I consider those the anti-discrimination provisions, but there's also affirmative provisions, which requires a housing provider to do something additional. And here are the main ones: reasonable accommodation and modifications. Section 804 F3A for reasonable modifications, and B, reasonable accommodations, requires housing providers to permit reasonable accommodations and modifications when it's reasonable and necessary for persons with disabilities. There's also design and construction requirements. If there's a multifamily dwelling unit constructed after March 13, 1991, if it's a multifamily of 4 units or more, all the ground floor units must be built in a way that's accessible to persons with disabilities. If there's an elevator, then all the units have to be built in a way that's accessible to persons with disabilities, and there's specific design and construction requirements. Again, that's an affirmative requirement. It's not simply anti-discrimination, but contains an affirmative requirement. Have to do something more to break down patterns of discrimination and segregation.
In case anybody's new, could we talk about what an example of modification and accommodation for persons with disabilities would be?
Yeah, modification would be a structural change, like a ramp. Installing a ramp would be one. Grab bar is a classic example as well. Now, if it involves federal financial assistance, it would be subject to the Rehabilitation Act. That would be at the housing provider or landlord's expense. But if it doesn't involve federal financial assistance, then a modification will be at the tenant's expense. Accommodation is permitting someone basically an exemption to the otherwise applicable rules, policies, and procedures because of someone's disability. For example, if there's a no pet policy, a reasonable accommodation could be an exception to the no pet policy because someone needs an assistance animal. That's a really obvious one. Liz, I don't know if you want to give other examples of reasonable accommodations.
Sure. So, somebody asking for maybe an application in a specific electronic format because they have software that would read the documentation to them, asking for permission to have a live-in caregiver or an extra set of keys so that aides and chore workers can come and go. Automatically, accommodations become the responsibility of the housing provider because it's a change in your rules, policies, procedures, and services. So the burden automatically shifts to the provider. And it depends on what's reasonable. So reasonableness is a factor that can be evaluated as part of the request process. It can't be anything that's outside of the scope of the housing provider's operations. For example, being asked to provide transportation to the grocery store if there's no transportation included with the provision of housing, there's no insurance, there's no accessible van, et cetera, things like that. So it's one of our hottest topics, which is why I just wanted to take a moment to talk about the rights of people with disabilities and the responsibilities of housing providers, because disability has been our number one basis of complaint since 2015. And nationally, it's probably been, about 10 or 15 years where it's come out on top. And I think also for you as well, Steve, would you say?
Absolutely. I'm working on a year-end summary for HUD, and we had over 100 last year, 2023, over 100 reasonable accommodation and modification complaints.
Okay.
Yeah. And so it's a real hot topic, very important. Overall, nationwide disability complaints are over 50% of the complaints that come in. Race would be about the next maybe 33%, and then other protected class categories would be beside that. So absolutely important that, we're not going to go into a great detail here. For reasonable accommodations, HUD has you want to look at the HUD regulation for reasonable accommodations, 24 CFR Part 100. And the same thing, you want to look at the HUD regulation for reasonable modifications, and in that same section. Then you want to look at the HUD has a 2004 policy, a HUD DOJ joint policy on reasonable accommodations under the Fair Housing Act. There's a 2008 HUD DOJ joint statement on reasonable modifications under the Fair Housing Act. And then when it comes to assistance animal, there's a 2020 policy dealing with assistance animals. But you got to look at the HUD regulations and the policy statements to make sure that you're in compliance.
Absolutely.
Those things have been out for a long time. If someone is not following the regulation or the guidance, it's going to be interpreted as they don't care to be in compliance, and that's not a good situation for anybody to be in. We're not hiding the ball. We're bringing the ball. We're showing you the ball. Please. Train your
Lots
people.
Of resources.
Contact our offices. We will provide training for you, absolutely, and walk through it in greater detail. Thanks.
We have lots of resources on that on our website as well. I know you have a great resource series on your website too, Steve.
Thanks. So what's the policy of affirmatively fair housing marketing regulations? And this is 24 CFR 200.610. It's the policy of the department, that's HUD, to administer its Fair Housing Act housing programs affirmatively as to achieve a condition in which individuals of similar income levels in the same housing market have the like range of housing choice available to them, regardless of 7 protected class categories under the Fair Housing Act: race, color, religion, sex, handicap or disability, familial status, or national origin. Each applicant for participation in FHA subsidized and unsubsidized housing program shall pursue affirmative fair housing marketing policies in soliciting buyers and tenants and determining their eligibility and in concluding sales and rental transactions. And that has affirmative fair housing marketing requirements handbook 8025.1 has a similar purpose of the AFHM plan requirements. And you can see they reference how it also HUD used it to meet its statutory mandate under section 808E5 to affirmatively further fair housing. And at the bottom, Liz, I had this from your input. No applications for applicable HUD assisted programs may be funded without an approved plan. So you got to have it.
Yeah, it's a key element to not only getting the project up and going, but also keeping the doors open and staying in good compliance.
I don't want it to be negative, right? And that's why I have a couple of slides here to show that integrated housing is an important priority. And Senator Hart from Michigan said, Congress recognized where a family lives, where it is allowed to live, is inextricably bound up with better education, better jobs, economic motivation, and good living conditions. Well put.
Very
And
well.
the Supreme Court in the Traficante case, right? The reach of the fair of the proposed law. They were construing the recently, that time it was recently enacted Fair Housing Act, was to replace the ghetto by truly integrated and balanced living patterns. And so, yes, the Fair Housing Act has anti-discrimination provisions, but it doesn't break down patterns of segregation leading to integrated housing, except in the affirmatively furthering fair housing requirement and the fair housing marketing plan process. So those are critically important to achieve integration. I would hope we all consider integrated housing to be the goal. I would hope. Sometimes people don't often say it, you know. I like living around people that are variety of people, people that have views like mine, people who have views are not like mine, people who look like me, and people who don't look like me. I like a mix, like a flower garden where all the flowers don't look the same. That's how it should be. We want a little variety and spice in our life, and it's healthy.
It is, and economically more sustainable.
Yes. And here's one where sometimes people miss this. Simply refraining from discrimination. Your people, right? Don't discriminate. But that's not enough. That does not break down patterns of segregation, right? This is affirming fair housing. The final rule that it promulgated is this is not only a mandate to refrain from discrimination, but a mandate to take the types of actions that undo historic patterns of segregation and other types of discrimination and afford access to opportunity that has long been denied. And there was an early NAACP versus HUD case. Every court that has considered a question held that Title VIII, the Fair Housing Act, the affirmatively furthering fair housing requirement imposes upon HUD an obligation to do more than simply refrain from discriminating, right? The broader goal of truly open housing reflects the desire of HUD to have its grant programs to assist in ending discrimination and segregation to the endpoint that supply of generally open housing increases. So just to make clear, we should all, I mean, it underlies it. The policy is we're breaking down patterns of segregation. And that's the goal here.
And I think proactive is really key. One of the big takeaways we want you all to have from today is doing this proactively, looking to be proactively in compliance on the front end. It's a great risk management strategy to do the work on the front end. And I always say, if you've listened to any of my trainings before, you know, document. Well, this is a documentation heavy process. So we appreciate you taking the time to join us this morning. And we'll be circling a lot to these themes because they really underlie this work and the importance of this work.
Yeah. And here's, you know, there's pushback often, right? That it's social engineering, it's top down, federal government control over the processes and things like that. Actually, not. You are the expert on your development, on your community. And so there is a great deal of flexibility baked in. But so your hands are not tied. In fact, HUD is relying, MSHDA is relying on your creativity to meet the needs, particular needs of your community, because you've got the boots on the ground to know how to reach the various groups that are not coming in applying for your housing. Former Secretary Sean Donovan put it this way: the folks fighting segregation aren't social engineering. Segregation was created by social engineering. Far more often than not, segregation, isolation, and poverty don't occur in spite of government. They happen because of government, by government dollars and government decisions made with government authority. And if you want to take a backdrop, our southeastern Michigan community now actually has increased segregation in the last 10 years. Shocking, appalling. We're the third most segregated area in the country. We used to be number one. We're third. Nothing to brag about there. And the sad part is they do studies of racial isolation, and metropolitan Detroit area is number one in racial isolation. So yeah, I can think I'm passionate about it. I should be.
There's a lot of
All
work to
right.
be done.
Oh yeah. Liz, this is my slide, but I'll you
Oh, sure.
explain this. Okay. What is this plan coverage? I mean, you have a lot listed here.
We do, we do. So we just wanted to highlight that there is a high volume of different types of funding and housing programs that are covered and need to meet this requirement and have the AFHM plan. It is a mouthful. So that marketing plan. All applicants for subsidized and unsubsidized multifamily projects, inclusive of mobile home parks and single family subdivisions of 5 or more units, spaces, or lots, which are funded or insured under certain HUD programs. So pausing right there, that is a big group. And it starts early on in the process. So it's important that you have this awareness. If you're seeking to develop any sorts of projects like those, you have to be aware funded or insured under certain HUD programs are subject to these program requirements that create this obligation to have the plan. It might include public housing authorities, nonprofits, developers, housing providers, other HUD program participants. So these are all examples of HUD programs which require the plan. I don't want to run through them necessarily by number, but home ownership and below market interest rate dollars programming can do that. 235 and 236 programs, condos and cooperative housing, nursing home and intermediate care, mobile home courts, as we said, or parks. Multifamily rental housing is a very common one. There's a couple of different categories there. Rental assistant and rent supplement dollar programs, Section 8 project-based assistance. So that's inclusive of Section 202. Projects that have Section 8 assistance, rural housing, Section 515 projects, also with that assistance, loan management set-asides and property disposition set-asides, project assistance grants, or PACs. Also, we want to make sure, second to last there, 1 to 4 family mortgage insurance for homeowners. So very broad. If you're not sure if your planned project or your current project is subject to this, this is one of the first homework assignments we will assign you is, figure out the funding and make sure you kind of follow that trail of crumbs, so to speak, so you understand how you are funded and which regulations you are subject to. If you have questions about that, you're welcome to contact a local fair housing center. There are 4 of us across the state of Michigan, and we'll share that information later on, but contact your local fair housing center, contact MSHDA, contact HUD. Make sure you really do this homework so you understand which obligations you have, again, so that you can be proactively prepared and also stay in compliance. So hopefully that was helpful. I know that was a lot of information.
Yeah. So what are the regulatory or contractual requirements for the AFHM plan? Again, some people would say AFHMP or AFHM plan, kind of synonymous. Well, first, there's Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Regulations, 24 CFR Part 200 Subpart M. That is really the key one that you need to look at. They set for the AFHM requirements for HUD subsidized and unsubsidized housing program, and Section 200.600 requires submission of a plan and outlines the components of the plan. There's also compliance procedures, and this is where HUD does a review, approval, inspections, whatever if you want to call it enforcement process. That's at 24 CFR Part 108. There's also a key guide is HUD's Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Marketing Requirements Handbook. I'm going to put a link on to that. It's kind of large, but I combined it into a single PDF file. And there's also contract documents that you sign with HUD that lists the federal involvement and the requirements of your housing program. So those are the key things that you need to be aware of. And it's kind of in priority with these. I mean, they're all important, but if you have real questions, it's the regulations that really govern what you do. They're not that many to look at, but it's helpful to look at those. I mean, certainly you can go to the handbook. Probably people are looking at the handbook and nothing else, but sometimes it's good to look at those regulations to see any questions that may arise.
And I often will
yeah.
Google them, just copy this language and throw it in the search window so I can go directly to that component and just kind of focus on that. So I recommend the old-fashioned tool of Googling the specific regulation as well.
Yeah, and I always like to make the point, right? It's not, well, this is the law, you better comply or we're coming after you, right? That's not the point. The point is I think the better approach is to say, well, this is an opportunity to make our community better, right?
Mm-hmm.
And take it, if you approach it that way, I think you'll find more satisfaction in the process. At the end of the day, hey, I've done some good things with
Mm-hmm.
my work, right? And that's really a good way to do it.
Yeah. And we believe that good fair housing practices are good business practices. You know, all of these steps and these requirements that we'll review in more detail here are all about, you know, casting a broad net, getting as many qualified applicants as possible, getting the word out for people now more than ever, right? I mean, how many phone calls do you think you're getting every day, Steve, from people looking for housing or having questions about maintaining their housing? It's on record levels for us.
Nonstop, not
Nonstop.
a day goes
Absolutely.
by.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're talking well over 1,000 calls for our office that we're just generally looking for housing opportunity. So having good partners out there doing this good work is key to the success and sustainability of our communities.
Yeah, and you should feel good about the work that you're doing. Your work is very, very important. So there's a little bit of guidance from HUD. And when does the uh, plan has to be reviewed and approved? Obviously, you must submit a firmly fair housing marketing plan to HUD's Office of Fair Housing Equal Opportunity when at least 5 years have lapsed since your last review, or the local jurisdiction has changed their consolidated plan, it's been updated, or significant demographic changes have occurred in the housing market, and the owner conducted analysis to determine the population least likely to apply for housing is not identified in the current plan, or the advertising, publicity, or outreach are no longer appropriate and require modification or expansion. There's another alternative when the owner also adopts a residency preference for admission of persons who reside in a specific geographic area. You want to start a residency preference area. Then you will do what? Right. Then you also have to do an updated plan. And also the owner adopts admissions preference for admission of persons who reside in an unspecified geographic area that hasn't been previously approved. So those are the two circumstances in which HUD requires that your plan be amended plan be filed. And on the form, you just check off, it's going to ask you what the form, and you're going to list that it's an amended one. Mm-hmm. But good guidance there. Mm-hmm. MSHDA has a similar one. MSHDA AF plan requirements. It says all MSHDA finance developments must maintain a current approved affirmative fair housing marketing plan on site. It ensures that owners of the MSHDA finance developments are taking steps necessary to eliminate discriminatory housing practices. If the development's plan is older than 4 years, no plan can be found. They must revise and submit a new plan for MSHDA approval. And again, the plan should incorporate and reflect current marketing areas demographics as of the application date. And interesting, if you look at the MSHDA form 44A, that's the plan document that MSHDA requires, it references HUD handbook 8025.1. So much of what we say about HUD applies to MSHDA requirements as well. So you're not going to be facing really, I mean, the forms may be slightly different, but you're not facing conflicting obligations between what MSHDA is asking for and what HUD is asking for. Your expertise on one should help you with the other.
Absolutely. And I will say the HUD handbook, while it is lengthy, something that I found really instructive, as you know, Steve and I are not in the daily practice of developing these marketing plans. So what we can do is talk about them from a fair housing center perspective. We are not on the, marketing side and the development or provision of housing side of things. So I found the examples throughout the handbook to be really helpful. So even if you just do a word search at Control F and look through and find those examples, they are really, it's lengthy, but it's well thought out in terms of helping explain a lot of what we've been talking about, the intent behind this and some specific scenarios that you can, get hard takeaways from. So I really encourage, of course you want to use the handbook in its entirety, but maybe, especially if you're new to this, I would definitely recommend looking at the examples throughout that.
Yeah, and we're also going to post on our website. MSHDA was, kind enough to provide a sample MSHDA plan, and so we'll provide that as well on our websites. If so, you'll have a sample I'm not saying you have to follow it exactly. Obviously, your situation will change on your specifics, but you'll have that available as well. Anything we can do to make your process more streamlined, more user friendly, we're happy to do that.
Yeah, and I think this is something MSHDA is actively looking at and working on as well. So make sure you're staying in close connection with MSHDA, and they do have a really nice fair housing page. And I recommend you kind of stay connected as best you can. These are responses that are to be provided to MSHDA in a narrative format, and I think they're really helpful. The way they've kind of broken them down. Obviously, we want to look at what is the target population within the market area, what are the boundaries of the development, what percentage of the market population is minority, and identifying target populations, which especially means populations least likely to apply for this residence or this opportunity. So kind of starting with a lot of information gathering, and we'll look at some one tool that you might want to use before we close today as well. Identification of concrete and credible outreach efforts. So what target population and disability rights or community groups or organizations will be contacted? Who is this? Who are you looking for? One of the resources that I would share out is that there is a Michigan Disability Network. They used to be called Centers for Independent Living. You might remember that, Steve, CILs.
Yeah.
A lot of the agencies now have rebranded their disability advocates or disability network groups, but each county in Michigan is affiliated with a disability network group. So that is a key resource. And I'll throw that link in the chat at some point before we end, and we'll make sure to provide those out. But you've got to make sure you have current information for those addresses and telephone numbers. You know, a lot of groups now have a very active online social media presence. So making sure that you're connected on all of those platforms and creating strategy. What method are you going to use to contact those outreach groups? And really pushing yourselves. There's state offices for deaf and hard of hearing individuals, blind and visually impaired individuals. There are, thankfully, a lot of resources across the state with different groups. So it's important to do that legwork, create that database, and then maintain it and keep it up to date. It's also important to delegate who's responsible for completing this outreach program, what media outlets are going to be used, how will printed materials be distributed. We encourage you to think about accessibility and do accessibility checks in creating electronic and printed materials. There's so much information available online on how to do that, from which font to use, what size font to use, what contrast you want to use. So really thinking about being inclusive with the materials as best you can. For the budget, it's important to have a breakdown of the overall marketing budget and which part of the budget will be used to implement the plan specifically, how much money is budgeted for commercial media usage, et cetera. And then also MSHDA will look at and evaluate previous experience. Has your firm marketed a subsidized housing development, including under MSHDA previously? What's the prior experience of your group in writing and achieving affirmative marketing goals? And then providing, kind of some of that background information on what's happened in terms of your goals and achievement. So it's pretty comprehensive, but they did break it down here, I think, in a way that's helpful to design the overall process and also helps with implementation and hopefully keeping that plan active and alive during those years when it's in use before it becomes outdated through time or con plan adjustments or demographic changes, as Steve noted.
So they're going to look at key components of a marketing plan for HUD, and then we're going to look at MSHDA real quick, but there has to be targeted marketing activity that begins with identifying populations that are not demographically, racially, ethnically, that are least likely to apply without special outreach efforts. HUD requires the worksheet to be completed, and there's also a residency preference that's optional. If you do it, you have to give not only geographical area for the preference, but your reason for the preference and complete a worksheet. That's optional.
Can I just add something there, Steve? From a fair housing perspective, residency preferences have to be done with extreme caution in our experience. When we're looking at high levels of segregation, if you establish a residency preference, you might unintentionally be perpetuating segregation. And so we just really encourage a fair housing lens on that component, if that makes sense.
I mean, I react the same way to it. I don't like it. I just don't. The voucher program is the idea is that's supposed to be portable, right? Residency preferences like that kind of do the opposite. It just keeps communities the way they are. If the goal is to take down segregation or take down some of those barriers, residency preferences, kind of cut the other way.
Mhm.
So I don't know what to
Extreme
say.
caution, extra stars there, I guess.
Oh
Red ink.
yeah. Oh yeah. And then there's HUD's disparate impact rule talks about that. Actions not only that have a disparate impact on a protected group, but actions that result in the perpetuation of segregation is a separate violation. That's something that's not found in employment. It's only found in housing because it's so important.
Right.
So
And if
that's
you do
one that it
have,
can be a problem.
if you have a residency preference, let's say you inherited one or you're coming across the fact that it's, in function, do periodic evaluations. Really push yourself to be accountable for this, to show that you're monitoring that this is not something that is perpetuating segregation unintentionally, exactly because of disparate impact. Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, no, this again, this is from the HUD form for multifamily, the plan for multifamily. There's separate ones for 1 to 4, single family, so forth and so on. So it depends on the type of housing. Make sure you use the right form. There's also, you have to list proposed marketing and outreach activities. Like Liz mentioned about the community contacts, there's a worksheet has to be completed for that. And there's also a worksheet that has to be completed by the proposed methods of advertising, what kind of venues you're going to be doing for your advertising, the various methods. There's a requirement that you put up a fair housing poster, must be put in all offices displayed where sales rental activities take place. We don't always see compliance with that with our testers. Often don't see those fair housing posters, unfortunately. And then there has to be an evaluation of marketing activities. You have to have some concrete measure, quantifiable measure of how your success will be measured, and identify the kind of challenging what decisions will be made about future marketing efforts based on your evaluation or the results of your evaluation process. And another key component is staff training. You have to show your staff experience, training, and assessment, not only in terms of your fair housing marketing plan, but also the non-discriminatory requirements of the Fair Housing Act. So they absolutely need to be trained.
And documented that the training was received.
Yeah, that's, for example, like provide copies of the training materials, and that is a good
Or a
thing. MSHDA has
certificate if
that
you
as
have
well. Right. We do training. They should regularly ask for that. I provide a detailed outline of the training and the topics and the time. But sometimes people don't ask. I provide it, but sometimes people don't ask. It's kind of surprising. So the MSHDA key components is similar. This is from the MSHDA form 440C. Current housing market composition, identify the percent of each race in the area. That's very similar to what HUD requires for its targeted marketing activity. Then MSHDA requires the direction of the marketing activity, where your marketing effort is being focused. And again, you're hitting on applicants of protected class groups that are least likely to apply either because of location or other factors. And the special outreach efforts are needed to encourage them to apply, come to your development. Then it has to set up a marketing program listing the commercial media to be used, the identification of the audience and duration of the advertising. I mean, I always ask, anytime I do any advertising, I ask for the data on the reach of the advertising and what groups it's reaching. That should always be there, available. Describe the brochure, signs, and HUD fair housing poster, and then you describe and list the community contacts. Liz said quite a bit about that. Then list future marketing activities like newspapers, publications, radio, television, brochures. And then MSHDA is very detailed in terms of the fair housing experience and staff training. They list the experience of staff in marketing to the racial group least likely to apply. I'm sure that's a challenge for many groups, but it's a great question for MSHDA to ask. And list the frequency of staff trainings, whether it's done biannually, annually, or other basis. I would say at least biannually, at a minimum, provided it's like a 3-hour training, or but less than that, I just think that's very high risk. It's not appropriate. And
the
then
laws have been changing as of late. We've been doing this a long time, not to give our age away. But
they do. And every time I've done like I'm doing it for the conference, Michigan Department of Civil Rights having conference dealing with fair housing in June, doing updates. And we do one for Professor Moak at Wayne State, has an urban planning class. Our center has presented there for over 20 years. And it's just amazing how many changes occur each year. So you want to make sure you're up to speed on that. Not only at the federal, state, also local levels. For example, many jurisdictions are adding source of income. People need to know.
Right.
Just this week, we saw listings for homes by a management company. We didn't catch them per se because they're not a property management company handling apartment complexes. They're just managing single family homes that are being listed for rental. But on their website, no Section 8. The problem is they're marketing their homes in properties where the local jurisdiction has source of income coverage. So they're
So a
just
risk
not,
right there.
they haven't been trained. That's all I can say.
Yeah. That's inviting an investigation, I would say. When you another compelling reason not to advertise in discriminatory ways, which we will talk more about.
Yeah, but the key sources of MSHDA, 440A form and the Form 40B instructions are very helpful to look at.
And those are links that will work when we share the slides.
Yeah.
Okay. So some key goals and components continued. Indicating the number of units you expect to rent to the population you identify is least likely to apply. So adding some real specific detail, providing the same information for persons with disabilities. Again, focusing on that breakdown of your overall marketing budget and highlighting the pieces that will be used to implement your plan, specifically indicating how much money you've spent. We talked about that. Dedication of staff who's responsible for completing the program, and highlighting that prior experience included as well. That continuous outreach program to maintain a well-balanced waiting list is something we haven't talked about yet, but this is what I talked about in terms of good fair housing practices being good business. Right now we do have a housing shortage and high demand, but I've experienced markets where it was not quite the case. So having that broad reach, a balanced waiting list is important to make sure you're meeting these goals and it's good for business. Make sure you're including housing discrimination disclaimers on all preliminary and full application forms. So that's a quick homework to do, checking on that language, making sure there's a disclaimer there. The disclaimer will pledge not to discriminate against applicants based on any of the protected classes. As we've stated, these are the 7 federally protected classes, but we do have additional Michigan protections, including specifically sexual orientation and gender identity, marital status, and age here in Michigan. Of course, using the equal housing opportunity logo, accessibility logo, use that. I like to say use it obnoxiously. I mean, there's no reason not to anymore with technology. I will admit I'm old enough to have cut it out and taped it to a flyer in order to have the logo there. Now we can pop it in so easily. You can download it from the HUD library. Our website has a link to it. Have those posters and logos broadly available and visible. It's something that HUD recommends or requires to be looked for in testing and investigations. So that's an easy thing to check off the to-do list. If you are doing any prospective residential preferences, we've talked quite a bit about the risk of doing that. You need to identify them and make the presence known. And I would say also include a real stringent fair housing assessment in terms of that preference. And then commit to review the development's plan every 5 years to update and maintain the objectives of it based on the latest demographics. So that's something about, what systems can you put in place to make sure that, 4.5 years in, it's on your radar that this is coming up and the work is updated in a timely manner. You don't want to be out of compliance or late with that type of deliverable.
Yeah, could we go back to the previous slide just real quick?
Thanks.
That these are certifications. So when you submit the MSHDA plan, you are certifying your goals A through F, and that you're meeting the requirements of A through H. So these are certifications that you have to do when you sign off on the submission of your plan. So MSHDA does not view these as optional in any respect.
Correct. So this is the commitment is what I'm hearing. Yes. So
Yeah.
you, and again, I think the goals, the steps that they've outlined for the plan will really put you in a good place to implement it. You've already done all of the planning in detail. You've got the funds set aside for it. And now they're making sure that it gets implemented.
Which is a great lead into the next slide, Liz. Okay. So what are the mistakes that happen?
What do we see in terms of what not to do? These are not best practices. So incomplete information, the benefit of being thorough, and we do understand, and we will look at some data tools, one data tool that's available But, make sure you are being as specific as possible. We see incomplete data of like the number of units, the price of units, the marketing area. If it's not included, it's considered incomplete and it doesn't really further the plan and it's not going to set it up for success. If you don't do sufficient research, simply stating that all ethnic groups are considered least likely to apply is problematic. If you can back that up with data, then you've at least got that ability to point to the fact that you did the research. But quite often you'll find things have changed. It's important to really localize this. And Steve said it earlier. This is a flexible process given these are applied to a huge variety of different types of housing. So it's reliant upon all of you to do the local work, have that local knowledge, but also as a general best practice for fair housing, you've got to show that you did the work. What information have you gathered to really back up the direction your plan takes? Failure to advertise in places used by people who have been deemed least likely to apply. This, again, takes some creativity and takes some work to figure out what are the advertising or media venues that are the best way to reach people that you have identified as least likely to apply. In some ways, that's gotten a lot simpler because we have the internet, because we have so many different platforms. We can do things more affordably. We have the ability to do print, and most print packages that we do with our PSAs, our public service announcements, it's a combination. It's a printed piece with some sort of electronic banner or a companion social media post. So take advantage of those types of reaches. Something that's really critical is not following up with community contacts to ensure that the housing opportunities actually went out. So it's not enough to just kind of do a mailing and send some pieces out and consider that done. Follow-up and documented follow-up, I think, is a really critical step to ensure this information has been meaningfully provided out. I think I knew of one example where one letter was sent to one group, and that's going to be deficient. That there's no way that's enough. Considering all the things that we've talked about. I've also seen kind of offhand that, having at least 10 contacts is a better strategy. And then again, making sure that those community contacts are pushing this information out, asking for proof that they pushed it out. Many community partners understand the need to do this. And so it doesn't hurt to ask for that information, a copy of the email, screenshot of the post. Another mistake, no standards in place to ensure that it was effective. So how are you measuring this reach? How are you measuring the success, so to speak? And then as we've hammered on, I think quite a bit, that there's not enough staff training or not current training on fair housing laws. So mistakes to avoid. Anything you want to add, Steve?
No, I think those are very, very, those
They're
are all
the
things that
common
occur.
ones.
I find the last one amazing, that there aren't people really reaching out for the training. I'll share more in a second. But Liz kind of said, well, we don't, if housing centers, we're not day-to-day submitting these kinds of plans. That's true. But when in terms of meeting fair housing requirements and the marketing and outreach, well, there we have a ton of expertise on that. But we don't want to just look over your shoulder and say this wrong, this wrong, this wrong. No, we want you to do things that are correct, and we're there to help.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we have a couple of takeaways in terms of best practices to provide property information, provide advertising about housing opportunities. So ads should not contain explicit exclusion, limitations, or other indications of discrimination based on any protected class, but specifically we do see it a lot in terms of for persons with disabilities. We've seen ads that say no wheelchairs, or not for the elderly or infirm is another example that comes to mind. So, really promoting a negative or including a negative phrase really is not a best practice, and it should be examined as to why is that there? What is the intent with that? Oftentimes it's going to be seen as discouraging or even a barrier. So really review your advertising very carefully. Ads containing descriptions of the properties, services, or facilities or neighborhoods generally do not violate the Fair Housing Act. Again, we want to have some great scrutiny there. One of the things we would recommend reviewing is a HUD memo by the Secretary, last name Achtenberg, the Achtenberg memo that talks about advertising. It is from 1995, so the information in it is a little bit dated. Doesn't talk about man caves, for example, which is a gender reference. But it does give some specific examples, like a fourth floor walk-up or walk-in closets are not on their face discriminatory. But there's lots of ways you can simply change language to make sure that it's more inclusive. We get asked questions about walking to the bus stop or walk to the park. Well, tell me how many blocks it is. What's the distance then? If you don't want to use the word walk, tell me the distance. There's simple things that can be done to really be inclusive. Ads that describe the conduct required of residents, like non-smoking or sober, do not violate the Fair Housing Act. Ads containing descriptions of accessibility features, in fact, are lawful. And there's a high demand for accessible features in housing. The opportunity to talk about amenities like a ramp or grab bars, as we talked about, if there's a lowered work surface in the kitchen, roll-in shower, universal design entrance, no steps at the front door, things like that. Those property descriptions can and in fact should be used to promote the opportunities of accessible features. And if you have questions about advertising, we are happy to review ads and just give you our 2 cents. We are not attorneys, so we cannot provide any legal advice, but we are always happy to review an ad in its final draft form. Things that are considered more of an implied preference that might invite further scrutiny, or I would just ask why these phrases would be included, things like active or independent, stable, executive. Not even sure what the point would be in including phrases like that. If there is restricted membership, for example, in a HOA community or a homeownership association community, just state that it's membership, that membership is required. Mature and adult, we do have age as a protected class here in Michigan. So we would really caution against using those words, depending on the phrasing, of course. I've seen ads that promote traditional housing or traditional family, and I think that's invites too many questions and is very subjective. What might be a traditional family to me might be very different for someone else. So I think being clear, concise, and descriptive without kind of implied preferences is a best practice. You can make sure that your advertising is inclusive, not exclusive. Again, you don't want to unintentionally isolate half of your market, for example, by stating a gender preference or limit. You want to be sensitive and use caution when describing the property. Our number one rule of thumb that we say all the time is describe the property, not the people. That is a frontline advertising best practice. If there are any programs or services affiliated with the housing, you want to focus on the programs and services, not who they are perfect or ideal for. I think since I began working in fair housing, it's almost been a guarantee that we'll see a handful of ads where the housing opportunity is identified as perfect for this group of protected class members, and so we just strongly discourage that. It's really important to allow people with disabilities, older adults, families with children, anyone who sometimes gets marginalized, to determine what works for themselves. We may have the instinct to say, well, we really don't want anyone with young kids in this single family home because the steps are pretty steep or it's on a busy corner. That's not a choice that we can remove from those members of those protected classes. It's up to them to make that determination and not something that we would want to put out there. When in doubt, don't post it, don't publish it. Make sure you get a fair housing review. Make sure you think through, especially your list of protected classes. I don't think this is something we've talked about yet. Something I really recommend is getting familiar with the list of protections that exist based on where you are doing business, based on your geography. As Steve mentioned, there's a lot of communities that have source of income protections on the books. There's different protections that can exist at the local level. I think Ann Arbor, for example, has 23 protected classes within their city limits. So knowing your list of protected classes and then cross-referencing them with your communications and your advertising is a great strategy to help manage risk in fair housing ads.
I would even put it in the plan. I would put it in the plan. What are your protected class categories at the federal, state, local level? Put it in the plan.
Absolutely. That's great. It shows that you know them well and that you're being intentional. That's a great point.
Share it with your staff so everybody's on the same page.
Absolutely. Train, post it publicly in your office space. Make it a cheat sheet, however works best for you and your team, but make sure everyone is familiar and up to date with those. Truly, that's the first thing we do. And if we're determining whether or not something is a fair housing issue, is we think is who is impacted. And if they're on the protected class list, then we think, okay, we've got some fair housing work to do. And we recommend the industry do that as well. So directly under the Fair Housing Act, it's illegal, unlawful to make, print, or publish, or cause to be made, printed, or published any written or oral statements, any verbal statements that has a preference, limits, or discriminates based on any protected class. So this Section 804C is critical to all representatives of housing opportunities and specifically to advertising and marketing team members. You do not want to communicate in writing or verbally that there's any sort of preference, limit, or discrimination that's illegal under fair housing laws. It's something that is very broadly construed. It includes promotional materials, newspaper and internet ads, but again, verbal statements, that communication. These days we communicate by message, by text, by voicemail, by email. We have vastly increased the way that we communicate, and a lot of those files are saved and stored. So it's really important to be aware of that because those records can be created to either defend you or provide evidence of a fair housing violation. So flyers, brochures, deeds, signs, banners. We talked about applications. Any other document tied to a housing opportunity needs to be scrutinized for fair housing compliance. Exemptions do not apply to discriminatory advertising or marketing materials. So even properties such as senior housing that is 62 or older or 55 and older under the Housing for Older Persons Act or HOPA cannot advertise in a discriminatory way. So the the advertising provisions under fair housing are very, very broad. So that if that's something you have questions about, feel free to reach out to your local fair housing center to make sure that you're not unintentionally providing any phrasing or limits that would be illegal. So review. Do your homework ahead of time before it's published or posted. And again, describe the property, describe the program, not the people. And when in doubt, take it out. Do not hit send or publish or post or purchase that advertising campaign. Same thing with social media. As I mentioned, we have all different ways to communicate. That can be a real benefit to reaching more people. Not always. I do want to highlight that some of the web-based platforms have struggled with civil rights. Facebook and Meta have been sued multiple times under fair housing laws. So it's important to be aware that they are subject to it. And so is social media as we use it as advertisers. If you are advertising online, make sure to keep up with how the settings work in terms of what limits might be put to your audience. That's something that was really problematic early on with Facebook. They were limiting, well, first of all, they were kind of assigning you characteristics, whether they were true or not, but they were characteristics about whether you had a family, whether or not you were a parent, what your religion might be, your race, your age. All kinds of things were just kind of assigned to users. And then the content was limited based on who they thought you were. And that turned out to be very problematic because they were housing rental ads that were limited, credit ads, loans ads were all limited. So you really have to be aware of fair housing as you make your posts and as you look at how to expand your reach. You want to watch that language, make sure you're not positioning your listing as more or less suitable for someone based on a protected class. Avoid, of course, any direct references to racial or ethnic terms, to religion, exclusions based on disability. Review those posts, and if you allow for commenting, you have to keep an eye on that with your fair housing hat on. You can proactively include the equal housing opportunity logo and fair housing language. Make sure that you have, if you have a social media policy, that it includes fair housing compliance. Again, that's a great way to document your awareness, and make sure you're considering your full list of protected classes and that the reach is truly available. The information is truly available to all folks. Even if you're using caricatures, avatars, animations, illustrations, if they represent people, they must be inclusive as well. This is something that we see a lot as potential fair housing violations. Especially I'm using older adults here specifically. It's very easy to find, if I can even say clip art anymore, if folks know what that is, free images or royalty free copyright-free images of older white adults are prolific and easily available, versus on the right-hand side here, a campaign that's much more inclusive of different races and skin colors, different abilities. You can actually see older adults with adaptive equipment here, things like that. It takes intentionality. It takes having that budget. We had to purchase images to create comparable diversity to show a best practice here. So just for example, with human models is what we consider kind of using photographs of actual people.
Yeah, and could we go back to it for just a second? Like on the left are this is really at marketing and advertising for 55 and over, probably 62 and over, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, it could be challenged on grounds of age discrimination under Michigan law.
That's true too. Yes.
Just
These
so
are
it's clear,
seniors.
fair housing
Yeah.
violation, there's a key case out of New York, Reagan case, where it said it's a per se violation to use all white models in an ad. There must be a cross section of people.
Mhm.
Our office had a complaint many years back against Henry Ford Village, that same kind of a thing. So no, you want to be truly reflective and inclusive.
Mhm.
And that's fits within your plan. I mean, common sense, you're not going to be appealing to a wide spectrum of people if you don't take a close look at what images that you are displaying. So I would
Yeah,
hope this would be not a violation that we would be seeing.
We are working on it on a few locations here. I'll just say that. Unfortunately, it kind of trends every few years. It kind of bubbles up. The other thing that we see is a lot of phrasing. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the perfect for, ideal for, great for, looking for, these are all very short phrases that have very specific filters and reference, really a lot of these reference households without any children. Or
yeah, we had empty
age.
nesters only, or perfect for empty nesters,
Yes,
adults
yeah.
only property. This still goes on.
Mm-hmm. Requiring people to live independently, things like that are all potentially violations. 45 and older is not a legal age restriction. Even 50 and older is not legal. It's 55 and older and 62 and older. But generally, all of these are looking for households without children, for example, which is problematic.
So going back to the first, when we began, right? What would you do in this situation? How would you address it, right?
Yeah.
How did we get this information? We go on to the next slide. Came to for HUD's firmly furthering fair housing page and used the AFFH data and mapping tool. And so there's a couple mapping charts. Map 5, publicly supported housing by race and ethnicity. And then table 6 show public housing residents by race and ethnicity. So I'll show you the map that it showed. It had a map showing the various publicly supported housing. On the next slide, Liz. Hopefully it's showing.
It's there. Sorry.
There it is.
Lag.
And look at it. So it has them listed there. And then if you go down to the next slide, what I did was I generated a table, demographics of publicly supporting housing developments by program category. And then I basically downloaded the data to download the table file. If you go to the next slide, you'll see where it came from. So you can see public housing, it was Clinton Village, 89% Black, 9.57% white, just no Asian to speak of, and Hispanic, only 1%. And then you can see the project-based Section 8 programs, and it has the racial breakdown. And that obviously got our attention, right? So it's not the municipality. I mean, we put it in the analysis of impediments for Clinton Township. And what was the recommendation? To encourage each of these developments to have a fair marketing plan to address this, right? Very, very important to plan documents. I don't know specifics with it, but that's going to be a priority moving forward to see if we can address this. So, but this information is publicly available. So I can't say enough. Again, the AFFH mapping tool is for developing municipalities, entitlement jurisdictions developing, to help them to prepare their assessment of fair housing, AFH. However, I think it's very, very helpful in terms of the plan. it works as well. Any kind of data that you get is very, very informative. And we could drop back for any development and look at the geographic, I mean, all the way from where people are living, where they work, um, transportation patterns. There's just a wealth of information in the AFFH planning tool. So I would encourage you to take a look at it. You'll find it very, very informative, and that will really help you in formulating a really effective plan.
Yeah, and it's free. So something as a nonprofit we tend to struggle with is that we do not always have access to or dollars for data. So this is something that I put the link in the chat just now, and I've added a couple other links that you might want to grab, and we will share out, of course, afterwards. But it's really nice to be able to have access to free data that you can download. The mapping is really helpful. It does take, and Steve, I think we can admit this, it took us a few minutes to just kind of noodle back and forth and play with the website ourselves to find data, but it's, it's really beneficial to just take a look. And then if you are able to maintain these files, if anything informed the plan, you can download the information and maintain that as documentation or attachments to your plan. So really nice resource meant for municipalities, but it benefits all of us because anyone can use it.
Yeah, if you look on a couple slides back, I saved the links to the HUD AFFH page, then the mapping tool, then the map, and then the tables, so that I will forget in months, years to follow. You may not come back to your planning document for some time. Keep notes about where you got the information. That will save you so much time having to relearn. Basically, you'll be at square one if you don't keep good detailed notes about what kind of information and where you got that information. And it'll really help you in terms of updating it, but it'll also help you in terms of then going forward again and doing an assessment of how effective your plan has been.
Mm-hmm.
But speaking of free, we got some free resources listed here.
Yes.
Free.
Here, then. Yeah.
Yes. HUD's Firmly Fair Housing Marketing Regulations. You can see those Part 200 Subpart M, and Part 108 deals with the compliance part. Hopefully you're only dealing with Subpart M. HUD's not dragging you in on Part 108. The handbook
Doesn't
is
hurt
terrific.
to look at it, though. I say, look at
yeah.
the compliance side. I mean, let's learn from what not to do. Absolutely.
Yeah. And we're going to put on our websites the Firmly Fair Housing Marketing Handbook. That will be there as well. And then the forms are available. I actually, in the combined file, I have the Firmly Fair Housing Marketing Plan forms are right in the combined file with the handbook. I just found that to be very, very convenient.
That's great. Thank you so much for doing that. And again, with the 8025 handbook, I really recommend, that's where I was talking about some of the examples that I felt were really beneficial in terms of, what do you do if you find there's a property that's in a predominantly minority community? What are the steps that you would take? And then there's an example of the inverse of that. So just very practical in terms of learning from the examples they share.
Now on the next slide, you can, Liz and I, with reason, with focus, right? We've mentioned about reasonable accommodation and modification disability claims as being an area where there tend to be all too frequent violations. The other one is in advertising. Mm-hmm. HUD had 24 CFR Part 109 fair housing advertising. There was like a scale back during the Clinton years that, there's too many regulations. So HUD had to depart with one of its regulations. So they basically withdrew Part 109 fair housing advertising. However, it is still viewed as a good statement of the law. So you want to look at that in terms of advertising. Also, Liz mentioned, it's called the Atkinberg memo. I didn't put her name on it, but the HUD memorandum guidance regarding advertisements under 804C. That is the most controlling document. If there's a question between that memo and Part 109, obviously go with the HUD memo of January 9th, 1995, because that remains fully in effect. But between those two will give you quite a bit of guidance in terms of your advertising practices. For when it comes to MSHDA, you can use the agency's AFHMP plan instructions. And we're also going to be putting on our website a sample plan for MSHDA. I would think, I don't know, MSHDA kind of recommended it. I think it is. I looked at it. It's a pretty good plan. It'll give you some idea. It's probably quite a bit longer than you're going to use. but you can always, scale back and structure yours in a way that fits your situation.
Yeah.
And again, we've mentioned about HUD's AFFH data and mapping tool. Can't say enough about that. I think you saw the importance of that data. And I didn't even scratch the surface with the kind of data that's available under the HUD's AFFH page as well. And also some of the materials on these slides came from Liz. I don't know if Liz, you probably put it together, but the Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Plan is a good fact sheet that's available on their website. That's a great resource as well. I'll make sure we have that posted. But I just think it's a good checkpoint of what's required when it comes to affirmatively marketing.
Right.
So go ahead, Liz.
Yeah, no, that really nice set of resources, and we're ready, I think, now maybe for some questions.
While we're waiting for questions, we can go to the next slide and you can kind of, Mitch actually put this together. It's a very attractive fair housing resources, but it lists the contact for HUD, Michigan Department of Civil Rights, and then each of our centers, and it shows you the areas that we serve by color. It's very attractively, and you have our contact information on here.
Yeah.
So all Michigan is covered by HUD grants.
Yes, I'm the green counties, largely a little bit for the orange counties as well. I tend to do some education, and I think you do too, Steve, for the industry.
Yes.
The Southeast Mid-Michigan Fair Housing Center doesn't do these types of trainings necessarily, so we're happy to kind of be your first call for assistance.
Yeah. So yeah, I think this is a handy sheet to look at. It also has a link to our websites.
Yes, brand new, which is really nice to have. Yeah, and anyone can file complaints with HUD and the Michigan Department of Civil Rights, so they are also there both for enforcement and some education. I would say the June 12th Michigan Department of Civil Rights Summit is going to focus entirely on fair housing. That will be in downtown Detroit this summer with a chock full agenda of things that will be discussed. So if this is of interest, I recommend you check that out. And you'll be there. Unfortunately, I won't be, but I think you'll be there, right, Steve?
Yes.
Presenting, and some of our staff will present there as well. So that's a nice opportunity.
If we go to the next slide, thanks everybody for participating. What we will do is I will stop the recording because sometimes people have questions they want to ask and comments in that they really don't want to be recorded doing so. So we call it like an encore opportunity.
Sounds good.
Right. So I will stop the recording. But again, a big thank you for everyone for being here. Thanks again to MSHDA for generosity and sponsoring this training. And really, I find it a real pleasure always to present with Liz. Just does great work and has done so for many, many years. So we really appreciate you being a part of this.
So grateful to have you as a partner. I learn from you every time.
Vice versa. Same thing. Thank you so much.